So we're in the midst of a presidential election season, whether we like it or not. And we're hearing a lot of statements by candidates and by other figures in American politics that are challenging the power of the Supreme Court. And I'd like to help you understand what those challenges mean, sort of moving forward, for what we know about the federal government and for what we know about the powers of the Supreme Court. And I'm going to combine something we probably know a little bit about, the range of emotions that we feel when we're cut off on the road, and something we might not know a lot about, how members of Congress retaliate when they feel that the Supreme Court is veering into their lane or challenging the rules of the road. So, have you ever been in a situation like this? Granted, you've probably never been the driver of a giant tour bus, but just let's be in this example together. So, you're in the middle of traffic, and a couple of cars decide that their lane is an unacceptable place to be. So you just veer right in front of you. You don't understand why this is the place they need to be, but it's just there where they need to be right now. Or if you're just driving down a completely open road and someone decides that the best possible place for them to be is right in front of your car, tapping their brakes and ruining your cruise control. It's just, why? Why do you need to be there in my lane? So there are a range of emotions that I tend to feel when I am in these situations, and we're going to go through them together. Perhaps you can identify with some of these feelings. So the first way that I tend to feel is I just kind of shrug it off, right? I think, it's just going to keep going, so just get ready. So maybe they forgot to merge a while ago. Maybe they have somewhere very important to be. This is none of my business, and I'm just going to, all right. But sometimes I get a little angry, but I tend to keep it to myself. Really? Okay, so you haven't broken any laws by passing me, but what is it about being in my lane that is making your day better in some way? This is just, it's not okay to be inconveniencing me. And other times, I get pretty miffed. I've never taken action like this rambunctious pug is going to, but there are some situations where you might feel like the best option is to sanction the other driver in some way. Whether that means you're going to waggle your fist at them, or maybe you're going to do something a little bit more serious. So, I'm just going to get off of this because it's just a little too exciting. So this range of options that you have after someone violates the rules of the road also happens within the context of the separation of powers in our federal government. And I'll explain how. So you can imagine how the powers of each branch of government are divided. We can kind of imagine them looking like this 3-lane highway here. So according to the separation of powers, each branch of government has its own lane on this highway, right? There is a certain set of powers that each branch has that no other branch possesses. But what you'll notice about this highway is that the lines between the branches are dashed. And as we all have passed our driver's test, we know that that means that we're allowed to pass into the other lanes. So while each branch has a separate set of powers, the branches are also allowed to turn into the lanes of the other branches to check their authority, right? They're allowed to make sure that one branch isn't overstepping their power. But sometimes, when a branch changes their lane to check a power or to sort of check up on what the other branches are doing, they might be acting with legitimate authority, but that other branch might find that act threatening in some way. Members of the branch that has been cut off might then want to retaliate against the branch that has cut into their lane. So there are a couple of examples from sort of our recent political events that will give some color to this metaphor that I'm setting up here. So I want to pay special attention to this relationship here, where Congress perceives that the judicial branch is cutting them off in some way. So in the wake of the Supreme Court's decision on same-sex marriage this summer, members of the Republican Party felt as though the Supreme Court was overstepping its bounds in some way by doing a thing that's called legislating from the bench. And what this means is that there's a general sentiment, especially in the same-sex marriage cases, that states should have the right to determine how to balance the rights and interests at stake in these particular cases, and that states themselves should have the authority to legislate on the legality of same-sex marriage. So a lot of conservative members of Congress and conservative members of the political spectrum more generally think that the court has changed lanes, right? They think that the court has now come over into a power of the legislative branch, which is legislating, and they're not going to be happy about it. They're going to have a range of sort of retaliatory feelings towards the court. All right, so there are a range of factors that are going to determine how a member of Congress is going to try to retaliate towards the court when they feel that they are veering into their lane. And for the sake of this example, we're going to call all of these factors member of Congress's driving style. All right. So one reaction, thank you. One reaction here is to be upset, but realize that the court did not overstep its bounds by coming into your lane. So here we have Marco Rubio, very conveniently both a member of the Senate, but then also running for president. So he says lots of things like this, which are helpful for a presentation like this. So you can see by his words that he perceives that there's some legitimate authority of the court to act in this way, right? While I disagree with this decision, we live in a republic and must abide by the law. He's sort of in that position where he is quietly sanctioning the court. He's not doing something that sort of says that the court is violating their role. But if you remember the example with the pugs, this is my favorite. So if you remember the example with the pugs, another way that members of Congress can react is by trying to bump the court off the road, by threatening to limit their power in some way. So this example here from Ted Cruz says that he is going to propose an amendment to the United States Constitution that would limit the court in some way, right? By having retention elections for Supreme Court justices. So we can talk about the merits of this particular proposal over pizza, but the point here is that we are seeing Cruz sanctioning the court, right? He's trying to limit their lane, to squish it in some way. But the important thing is that I am not up here to attack conservative politicians. This is not a wholly conservative phenomenon. Democratic members of Congress also want to threaten the court and sort of retaliate against the court when they perceive that the court is coming over into their lane. After Citizens United, for example, Democrats vowed to retaliate against the court. And even more recently, yes, there's another wonderfully photoshopped picture here. After a wave of recent conservative decisions, Democratic members of the Senate, so here's Chris Murphy, they're struggling with sort of these, what they perceive of as ethical violations by the court. And what's kind of interesting about the Supreme Court is that every other level of federal courts and state courts have some sort of ethical code of conduct, but the Supreme Court does not have one. So there was this huge push by Democratic members of Congress to create or to force the Supreme Court to create a code of ethics. So again, this is Congress trying to squish the lane of the Supreme Court in some way by saying, all right, maybe you have some powers, but we're going to come in and tell you what to do. All right. So you might be wondering at this point, so what? Why do we care about sanctions to the court by members of Congress? It's an important question for all of us and also for political scientists who study this sort of thing. So does the court care? Does the court pay attention when members of Congress try to sanction them? So What is bad news for the Cruzes and the Murphys of the world is that these proposals usually are not enacted, right? They don't turn into law. We don't see the court's role shrinking in any formal way. So why does the court care? Well, there are some perspectives that are floating around out there in the world of political science. One is that some people think that the court's legitimacy may be damaged by these broad-sided attacks, so these huge sweeping ideas about how to limit the court's authority. And we think that the court might care about the legitimacy of its actions because it lacks any other meaningful enforcement mechanism. So if the court is afraid of losing public support, they may try to stay in their lane in order to avoid these attacks by members of Congress. It is also possible that the court is more likely to stay in their lane if a threat comes from someone with views that are similar to them. So you can imagine this as you're much more likely to take criticism from a friend than you are from an enemy. And finally, why should we care? This is the big take-home points, everybody. All right, so we should care about this because in order for the court to maintain its status as a co-equal branch of our federal government, it needs to have a lane that is the same width as the width of the lanes of both the executive and the legislative branches, right? It needs to maintain this power and this ability to serve as a valuable check on the other branches of government. And regardless of what political scientists think, we need to keep an eye out for these road rage attempts because they help us better understand this complicated relationship between the branches of federal government. Thank you.